So yes, indeed. How y'all doing? My name's Dr. Jamison, and I appreciate being here. I wish I could be there in person, but that didn't work out. But we'll make it happen. It's a little different experience being on Zoom, but I can't see y'all. You can see me, but we'll work it out. We'll get the energy and spirit going where we can spill each other. So what my paper looks at, what I attempt to do is look at Frantz Fanon and Fanon's relationship with African-centered psychologists, right? And even though African-centered psychologists talk about Fanon, there's a gap in between that sometimes. So what I wanted to do is put them in conversation with each other and have like this exchange between them two. So that's part of what I try to do in there. And there have been people who've done it, like FAMU, Florida A&M. They had a conference in November on Fanon. And of course, when they talk about liberation psychology, people put Fanon in there. But a lot of times they miss that intensive like discussion between those two. So that's part of what I'm going to do and talk to you about this afternoon. So part of what happens is that there are these different schools of thought that approach Fanon, right? So there's a postmodernist, post-colonial school of thought. Then there's like this political school of thought. Then it's another crew that looks at Fanon from a biographical type of perspective. And then of course, there are those who look at him from this political science type of perspective. And within those four, until recently, you don't have a lot of people talking about his psychiatry or him as a psychologist or him as a student of the African mind. So part of what I want to do is kind of like wrestle Fanon back from those schools of thought who do all those other things with him, and then put him in conversation with these African-centered psychologists. So Burhan, he's one of the, I guess you could say, one of the African-centered or Black psychologists who actually did study Fanon. Like he's like the main scholar who looked at Fanon. And he said the reason why some of these other groups, I know this is not scholarly, but those other groups who somewhat have like ganked him or taken Fanon away, he says the one is that his thought emerges from national liberation movements of the 50s and 60s. So there you get the political science crew coming in, right? And then his views on political violence. And I guess there we could also put that political / psychological or spiritual violence is also key. So we'll try to tie some of that in. His views on colonized bourgeoisie. So there they start focusing on class issues. And when he talks about the revolutionary character of the peasantry, again, that's a class issue. So again, these adherents who are often political scientists, historians, and sociologists. But Burhan does say that Black psychologists in the US continue to show a great deal of interest in Fanon and the problems he studied. And he says part of that is that you had these Black psychologists who were looking for a quest for intellectual relevance and affirmation of identity. So instead of looking at all these European thinkers who most of them were trained in or had at least tried to study them, then Fanon served as like this model for intellectual relevance and affirmation of identity. And with that being, that's why he struck a relevant chord with Black psychologists. So three major themes I want to focus on today. And like Doc said, I'm serious. Like they say in the church, not going to keep you long. I'm not going to try to keep you long either. I'm going to hit the points, build a little bit, and then we can roll. So three major themes. So Manichean psychology, deconstructing Eurocentric psychology, and applied cultural psychology. And I worked some things in between that, but those are the three major areas that we're going to look at Fanon's thought in conjunction with these African-centered psychologists. So the Manichean, the deconstructing Eurocentric psychology, and applied cultural psychology. So with this Manichean psychology, so Fanon and Manichean thinking has to deal with these bipolar opposites, right? So looking at the world or looking at anything in this polarized opposites, diametrically opposed type of way of thinking. So when you think of Manichean, thinking about the world being thought about in these dichotomies. And most of the time, these dichotomies are based on, let's say, good and bad, or God and the devil, emotion and reason, pure and sin. So there's no like middle ground. There's like this dichotomy between these two. So one of the things with Fanon and his Manichean thinking, he interrogated Manichean thinking. And then, of course, he extended that analysis into history and political practice. So for Fanon, this Manichean thinking was a central component of his psychology. And for him, it impacted both the oppressed and the oppressor. And that'll make sense later on a little more, but this idea of that it impacted the oppressed as well as the oppressor, this thinking in these bipolar opposites. Also, it could be argued, as far as like looking at these opposites, some people could argue that even African-centered psychologists, as far as the worldview analysis, especially as articulated by Kanban, that to some extent that's a Manichean thinking as well, but it comes from a different space as the type of Manichean that Fanon was talking about. So within that, here's Kanban's, well, part of his Kanban's comparative worldview schematic. So he would say that historically, African people, you see oneness, harmony with nature. You see this focus on the survival of the group. You see collective responsibility and this focus on spiritualism and understanding. So here Kanban is saying that in his worldview schematic, historically, these are the collective or the cultural patterns that you see expressed among African people, or as they say, ways of being or ways of knowing. In comparison to that, and this is what's somewhat similar to the Manichean, is that Kanban would argue that historically you see Europeans focusing on control, on mastery of nature, survival of the fittest, individual rights, materialism, and aggression. So this is Kanban's, his worldview schematic. So you see them both dealing with these bipolar opposites, but in somewhat different ways. Kanban also came up with this concept called cultural misorientation. And cultural misorientation means the over-identification with European culture among African descent people. And actually, he was my mentor, my Jegna when I was at Florida A&M. And we definitely stayed in touch. And so me and him would have these debates about whether you could replace the European with something else, anything non-African, and you over-identify with that as an African person of African descent, then that could probably be considered cultural misorientation too. So he let up a little bit, but that's how that went. So he calls it, well, one thing he says that everyone has this. If you grow up under conditions of white supremacy, domination, and control, then he argues that I don't care how African-centered you are, everyone is going to have some degree of cultural misorientation. So that's why in his scale, he has, you can have high CM, high cultural misorientation, medium cultural misorientation, low cultural misorientation. But he makes the argument that if you live under these conditions of white supremacy, you're not going to escape it. So he calls CM the collective psychological disorder of cultural misidentification. So that's building off of this over-identification. But as a psychologist, personality psychologist, he argues that it's a collective psychological disorder. Also, Kanban says that CM, or cultural misorientation, predisposes all other forms of Africana disorders. So this is interesting because here he's saying that cultural misorientation is at the root of most psychological disorders for people of African descent. So if you're checking it, you see how this culture is central to what's going on with this cultural misorientation, in that it predisposes all other forms of Africana disorders. So whereas the African-centered psychologists, with looking at Kanban is one way of looking at the worldview piece. Also, I'm not sure if Mama Linda James Myers is in there, but she also has another worldview analysis, which is at least has a little bit more room than Kanban's, but I wanted to use his to tie in with this cultural imposition. So whereas Kanban talked about cultural misorientation, Fanon specifically talked about this idea of cultural imposition. So I know we're not in class, so I can't go to the board, but I want to make sure we see the connections here. So think about some of the things we talked about with this cultural misorientation. Predisposes all other forms of Africana disorders. It's at the root of most psychological disorders. And then as we transition into Fanon, hopefully you'll see the similarities between the misorientation and the imposition. So Fanon says, a normal Black child, having grown up within a normal environment, will become abnormal on the slightest contact with the white world. So here's Fanon saying that, again, similar to the Kanban and the cultural misorientation, that once they become abnormal on the slightest contact with the white world, right? Then he says, with the exception of a few misfits, every effective etherism is the product of his or her cultural situation. So again, you could argue that the similarities with this predisposes, and then here Fanon saying that it's a product of his or her cultural situation, with a few exceptions. Fanon continues with his cultural imposition. He says that there are ideas, and he says a template of postulates, right? But slowly and subtly, with the help of books, newspapers, schools, and their texts, advertisements, films, and radio, work their way into one's mind and shape one's view of the world. So shapes one's view of the world. Then we look at this idea of worldview. And Fanon says that it's a cultural imposition, but sometimes it's slow and it's subtle. But through all these mechanisms, all these means, right? All these socialization factors, it creeps into your mind and shapes one's view of the world, or as African-centered psychologists would say, one's worldview. Lastly, Fanon says, when the Black person makes contact with the white world, a certain sensitizing takes place. The Black man stops behaving as an actual person. So here Fanon, again, is saying that there's something about this contact and this cultural imposition, right? Between the colonizer and the colonized, between the oppressed and the oppressor, that creates this certain worldview and a certain way of thinking once you internalize that. All right. Another concept that was interesting to look at between the African-centered psychologists and Fanon is that this idea of new African or new human being. So if you've internalized the cultural misorientation, if you've internalized the cultural imposition, then there has to be a new way of thinking, a new worldview. So Daoudi Azibo, he came up with this concept when he looked at liberation psychology that there would have to be a new African, right? This new African would have to come about, and this new African would deal with embracing African worldview. It would deal with limiting cultural misorientation, limiting CM, right? When we look at Fanon's new human consciousness, so as the African Center crew talked about a new African, Fanon talked about a new human. And if we think about people like Baba Wade Nobles, like to be African or not to be, and Africans being, I guess you could say, the template for what it means to be human, then are they the same or are they different? But I think the articulations are somewhat different. So when Fanon says that, he talks about the epidermalization of inferiority, the epidermalization of inferiority. And this epidermalization of inferiority is that people begin to believe, or African people, based on that cultural imposition, can start to believe that genetically they're inferior, can start to believe it's something about their skin. It's in them, epidermalization of that, the inferiority is in them. All right, so Fanon also had this point where he says that Blacks, building on the epidermalization, Blacks are sealed in their Blackness and whites are sealed in their whiteness. And in that, Fanon is saying that because of this epidermalization, because of people thinking that it's genetic, then Fanon is arguing that Black people think that they can't, the traits that are negative, that Manichean thinking, the negative traits being associated with Black people and the positive traits being associated with white people, they start to think that that's something internal. And so Fanon says that you can deconstruct those, right? Deconstruct those social definitions, since they're social constructs, and come up with other social constructs, therefore being a new human. Whereas you see Azibo focus on the new African, not necessarily this embracing of all humanity. But they both emphasize this notion of a new consciousness. And I think that's key of looking at the African-centered psychologists and the Black African in Fanon, but they differ in their articulation of how that process should take place. All right, the next section deals with deconstructing Eurocentric psychology. And within that, there's a critique by certain the African-centered psychologists critique of Fanon's reliance on and commitment to European-derived theories. So in that, they're saying that even in his critique in Black Skin, White Mass, that he himself had internalized, that he had some degree of CM. Like, they love him for some of those other concepts, right? But that he himself had internalized some of this CM. And especially his reliance on psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thinkers. But if you look closely, Burhan argues, and if you look closely at Black Skin, White Mass, even though I know that's his first book and he moves on to other things, but two examples are Jung and Freud. So when he looks at Jung and he looks at Freud. And what Fanon does, he specifically calls them out to say that they're not applicable to the experiences of people of African descent. So even though he uses those in some instances, he would use it in the instances if he's critiquing white supremacy, if he's critiquing colonization, then he's going to use that. Similar to the way you could say Frances Cress Welsing used psychoanalysis, and she used that Freudian approach, but she used it to critique white supremacy. She said, it's their theory. They're the people he was talking about, since it doesn't apply to Black people, so I can use it to address them. Or if you look at Bobby Wright, his psychopathic racial personality, Bobby Wright says, I'm going to take the World Health Organization's criteria for what's a psychopath. It doesn't apply to African people, but you made it up. It's your diagnosis, your criteria. So he goes down the criteria and says that, yeah, you qualify on this, check, qualify. So Fanon, in a similar way, uses it in that context. But when it comes to African people, Fanon has a different approach. So Fanon says, I have been struck by the disparity between the theories and the reality that Black people present. So these theories that these Europeans came up, he said there's a disparity between those theories and the reality of Black people's lived experiences. Then he goes on and says, there's a dialectical substitution when one goes from the psychology of the white man to that of the Black. So he's saying that almost there's this different psychology. So within Black psychology, with schools of thought, Karinga talks about a traditional school, a reform school, and a radical school. I'm not sure where Fanon would fit between the reform or the radical, but clearly here he's arguing that there's a different type of psychology going on when you begin to speak about African people's experiences. So finally, on this part, he also says the discoveries of Freud are of no use here. So again, he's clear that it's not applicable. He says the Oedipus complex is far from coming into being among Black people. And this is the one, I love this one here, because I don't know if, well, yeah, he knew what he was saying, but I think there's so much we can look at this from an African-centered perspective. When he says Jung wanted to go back to the childhood of the world, but he made a remarkable mistake. He went only back to the childhood of Europe. I wish I was there with y'all, because I hope there was some umphs there. Like, somebody may make a good point, you give them an umph. So hopefully there was an umph there, because here's Fanon saying that, like, we might word it differently, but he's saying that he was talking about European experiences in their childhood, right? But he didn't go back to the childhood of the world, because as Linda James Myers talks about, as we see with Bynum, as we see with Richard King and the Black Dot, we see now the childhood of the world we know goes back to what? The birthplace of humanity, and goes back to Africa. And we can look at what Freud and what Jung thought about Africa, right? All right, so I think there, Fanon, his critique of these psychoanalytic thinkers, it shows that he was not enamored by or infatuated with these European thinkers. And his critiques of psychoanalytic thinkers offers an early intellectual assault on the assumed universality of European psychological principles. So this intellectual assault on that, it's not universal, right? You can't just have Black psychology in white psychology in blackface, right? You have to, these African-centered psychologists made a decision that, am I a psychologist who happens to be Black, or am I a Black psychologist? And I think all this ties in with these people arguing that, no, they were Black people, African people first, and then psychologists. And therefore their psychology is going to benefit or be used in the best interest of African people. So this last section, applied cultural psychology. And Fanon has the importance of cultural context in which symptoms appear. So when he's working in Algeria, he's thinking about the different cultural conditions, like what might have caused those conditions, those symptoms that he sees. And again, y'all, if we think about that cultural misorientation with Cambon is saying the same thing, that some of these things happen, they occur in the context of a cultural situation. So then he demonstrates that therapeutic institutions need to maintain a concrete link to the culture of the patients. So even though sometimes Fanon is looked at as not looking at culture, if you look at some of the critical close readings of Fanon, if you look at it closely yourself, you'll see him focusing on this cultural context, but it's going to be specific to the cultural group that he's talking about. Fanon also incorporated indigenous cultural understandings in the attempt to blend pre-colonial understandings with contemporary conditions. So this will make more sense when we go back to the African-centered psychology crew. But so in this context, this was Islam because he was in Algeria, and the other indigenous things they had that went with the Islam, but still him understanding that he had to deal with that the indigenous cultural understandings had to be dealt with. You couldn't come and again impose this European sense on them. Also, this idea that religion, spirituality of his patients was not the opiate of the masses, but a crucial component of understanding mental illness within a cultural context. So the reason why this one is important is that even with some of his Marxist leanings, and I remember how Marx said the religion is the opiate of the masses, and I think that Fanon, at least when dealing with his patients, he understood that he couldn't just dismiss religion and take that out of the mix. So again, when we come back over to the African-centered psychologists, currently you see African-centered psychologists who are seeking to apply traditional African and African diasporic healing techniques. So you see these people who are some people who are actual like initiated, they're Ifa priests, but they're also clinical psychologists. So of course, when they write up what they need to for the insurance, they're going to have some DSM things up in there, right? But when they actually do some of the other things in the practice, they tie in traditional African and African diasporic healing techniques. So in that sense, you see African-centered psychologists are combining the role of clinical psychologist, counselor, with that of the role of the African healer. So you see those type of things going on as the discipline developed, right? As African-centered psychology began to develop, there was like, we can go from the concept of spirituality, but we have to actually practice it as well. So you see African-centered psychologists applying that. One of the concepts, there's been different concepts. Psycho, I guess you could say, is the foundational concept when African-centered psychologists start looking at spirituality as being the core. But now, if you look at Wade Noble's work, you look at Cheryl Brill's, you look at Linda James Myers, you see all these other psychologists extending that to actually using different West African and different types of Central African concepts. But one of the initial concepts that they identified was the idea of psycho. And the notion was that psycho is the Kemetic word for psychology, and that through what they call transubstantiation, and that's just fancy words for the meaning changes. The meaning of a word changes when you go from one culture to the other. But they come up with this idea of psycho, tracing it back to ancient Kemet. And psycho is defined as the understanding, the illuminator, the eye, and the soul of the being, that which inspires. So psycho, and they're arguing that this psycho is, let's say, this Kemetic psychology, or what we would call psychology now. But if the understanding, the illuminator, the eye, and the soul of the being, that which inspires, so the illumination of the soul, within a Western psychological context, that doesn't make sense. So psychology, the mind, rational thought, all this. And so psychology is going to say measurable, observable behavior. How can I measure this psycho, right? But again, that just shows us these different ways of knowing and ways of being, and that within this framework, it doesn't have to necessarily be measurable, observable. But then you could also argue that psycho is, if psycho is the illumination of the soul or the manifestation of your spirit, I see that spirit through your behavior. Right? So it's not as if remember that Manichean thing, it's not as if the spirit and the body, the actions, it's not as if they're separate. It's saying I see your behavior I see your spirit through your behavior. I explain to students, it's like when grandmama, you bring somebody home and grandmama like, something about them not right. Something about this spirit just doesn't sit right with me. And grandma wouldn't say, yeah, baby, that's that psycho perspective, right? But I do think that that's an example of the psycho, of the relationship between seeing this spirit and tapping in the spirit and how that relates to behavior. And you can sense it and feel it as well as see it. Again, tie back into the worldview. So in this psycho again comes out of this understanding that spirit permeates everything. Everything in the universe is interconnected. Collectivism is the most important element of existence, and communal self-knowledge is the key to mental health. So I'm sure you've heard most of these and looking at worldview and looking at African spirituality, but I think it's key just to keep those in mind. And also that last one, that communal self-knowledge is the key to mental health, which means that outside of the community, outside of the village, outside of then you can't really have it, right? So that being the key to mental health. Wade Nobles also argues that he talks about this shattered diasporic consciousness. So we have all these different places throughout the diaspora, of course, where where Africans were stolen and taken to. And of course, no one, like Dr. Clark used to say, no one ring a bell to say, drop me off in Trinidad, drop me off in Jamaica, drop me off in South Carolina, right? We were put in these places. But he argues that shattered diasporic consciousness is a result of a disconnected spirit. So again, if you look at the connection between the spirit and the consciousness, then that's why he ties it into a disconnected spirit, this shattered diasporic consciousness, because that's the core. This definition is important. He says to take away from, Saiku, the illumination of the soul. The Saiku Sheti, that's the practitioner of the Saiku. That's the person who practices Saiku. So the Saiku practitioner or the Saiku Sheti. And Wade Nobles argues that person, they need to take away from and keep us safe from alien spirits. And in this spirits, like, of course, we need alien spirits, but he's talking about alien spirits in the form of ideas, concepts, theories, paradigms, and practices stemming from white supremacy. So even as theorists, this idea of keeping away from those type of alien spirits and even seeing them as spirits. I think that, who was that? Amos Wilson, he talked about almost like cultural misorientation, cultural imposition being a form of spirit possession, right? In the form of that we've been possessed, or our spirit has been taken over by this other cultural entity that is not in line with our spirit and our cultural being. So that's why I think this alien spirit, this idea of being possessed, or even black skin, white mask. We think about in this context of a mask. When you put on a mask, you put on another personality. You take on another spirit. So if you look at black skin, white mask in that context, it's not just these ideas, but it's taking on this other alien spirit, this other cultural spirit or entity. Then finally, to bring it home and looking at this connection between the African-centered psychologists and looking at Fanonian psychology, Amos Wilson says, even in the context of being a spiritual basis, right? I would think about Amos said when they asked him what he thought about negritude once he got older. And he said that when he thought about negritude, he thought that the Haitian Revolution was negritude in action. And he said the Haitian Revolution was negritude in action. And if you look at that Haitian Revolution, we know the story. You got Duty Bookman. They have the Vodun ceremony. In that ceremony, they call down Ogun, and then they begin this revolution. So in that context, you have this spiritual base, but then it took these actions to bring it into being. And if we look at Amos Wilson, I think he's saying that once we had that spiritual base, but at the same time, he advocates for African-centered psychologists to become actively involved in psychological and political liberation. So there you have this meeting of African-centered psychology and Fanon. And finally, he says that African-centered psychologists must follow Fanon's position and embrace this intimate connection between critical cultural consciousness, political action, and social change. So from our spiritual base into seeing it manifested through actual political action and social change. All right, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.